For more than a century, people have tried to answer a deceptively simple question. Where did the Igbo come from? The answers are often confident, sometimes dramatic, and often wrong. You hear claims that the Igbo migrated from the Nile Valley, or that they descend from ancient Israel, or that they arrived suddenly from somewhere outside West Africa. What's striking isn't that these ideas exist, it's how rarely they are tested carefully against evidence. In recent years, DNA tests and archaeological discoveries have been pulled into this debate as if they can settle it once and for all. They can't. But when used properly, they do something more interesting. They force us to abandon simple origin stories and replace them with something harder and more enlightening. When people ask about origins, they usually imagine a starting point, a migration, a founding group, a moment when history begins. But most societies don't form that way. They emerge slowly, shaped by land, climate, trade, conflict, and internal choices made over centuries. Asking for a single origin point is like asking where a river begins without acknowledging its tributaries. This matters because many theories about the Igbo assume something dramatic had to happen: an arrival, an outside influence, a borrowed civilization. Maybe it's because of how formidable they are. So before we follow those theories, we need to ask a simpler question. What does the evidence actually show? We'll come back to that once we look at the archaeological record, because it tells a story DNA alone cannot. Genetic studies consistently place the Igbo within the West and Central African genetic landscape. They cluster most closely with neighboring Niger-Congo-speaking populations. That part is clear. Where confusion begins is with claims of Middle Eastern or ancient Jewish ancestry. Here's an important fact that rarely gets explained clearly. Human populations across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East share many ancient genetic markers. These markers often go back tens of thousands of years, long before modern ethnic groups existed. So when a DNA test shows a small overlap between West African and Middle Eastern populations, that does not point to a recent migration. Shared markers do not equal shared history. To put it simply, a trace similarity does not mean a group packed up and moved from the Levant to southeastern Nigeria a few thousand years ago. No peer-reviewed genetic study demonstrates a distinct recent Near Eastern origin for the Igbo as a people. DNA can show relationships and mixture. It cannot on its own tell migration stories. And we'll see why archaeology fills in what DNA cannot, especially when we examine sites like Igbo-Ukwu. Southeastern Nigeria has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. That alone already complicates most dramatic migration theories. But one site forced scholars to seriously consider old assumptions: Igbo-Ukwu. Discovered in the 20th century and dated to around the 9th century, Igbo-Ukwu revealed bronze objects of extraordinary technical sophistication, some of the most advanced metalwork known from that period anywhere in the world. What shocked researchers wasn't just the quality, it was the isolation. The metalworking style didn't clearly match North African traditions. It didn't resemble Mediterranean models. It didn't slot neatly into known diffusion pathways, which raised an uncomfortable question. If the technology wasn't imported, then it must have been developed locally. This doesn't imply isolation. Communities in southeastern Nigeria were connected to wider West African trade networks, exchanging goods and ideas while still developing their own systems. Earlier Iron Age sites in the region reinforce this picture. They show gradual cultural change, not sudden disruption. No evidence of a conquering elite. No abrupt replacement of material culture. In archaeology, large migrations usually leave traces: new settlement patterns, foreign objects, architectural breaks. Those signals aren't present. Instead, the evidence points to continuity, people adapting where they already were. And later, we'll see how this continuity links directly to social organization and how it explains innovation without central authority. Historically, most Igbo communities did not operate under centralized kingship. there was no single ruler issuing commands across vast territory. Instead, authority was distributed. Councils of elders handled governance. Lineage heads managed land and inheritance. Title systems rewarded achievement, wealth, and service. This wasn't chaos, it was balance. Forested terrain, dispersed farmland, and local ecological conditions favored flexible, small-scale coordination over centralized rule. Power was shared, negotiated, and constantly checked. These systems evolved through constant interaction with neighboring peoples, absorbing influences without being overtaken by them. To outsiders, especially colonial ones, this looked like disorder. In reality, it was a highly adaptive system that reduced the risk of collapse. And it explains something important. When societies depend on centralized rulers, invasions and migrations tend to leave clear archaeological signatures. When power is decentralized, change can happen quietly without visible rupture. That's exactly what we see in southeastern Nigeria. Here's another fact that surprises many people outside West Africa. Southeastern Nigeria supported relatively dense populations long before colonial rule. Land was intensively managed through compound systems and inheritance structures. Farming, trade, and settlement expanded without the need for large cities or imperial administration. In much of European history, dense populations required strong central authority to prevent breakdown. The Igbo case shows another solution. Much like the Tiv of central Nigeria or the Nuer of Nile Valley, it demonstrates how African societies have often thrived under distributed authority rather than centralized control. Order did not come from command. It came from social obligation. Civilization did not require empire. Coordination did not require kings. Later, we'll see how this same social structure fostered technological and artistic innovation, including the bronze craftsmanship at Igbo-Ukwu. Igbo-Ukwu's metallurgy did not emerge from conquest or state patronage. It developed locally, demonstrating that high technical skill could arise independently in the region without asserting influence over or borrowing directly from other centers like Ife or Benin. It spread through community knowledge and regional trade networks, supported by ritual and prestige demand. Innovation here wasn't imposed from above. It spread sideways. That made it harder for outsiders to recognize, but no less real. And this helps explain why scholars long sought a foreign source. The familiar models didn't apply. But as we'll see, that doesn't diminish the ingenuity of local development. Linguistics reinforces this picture. Igbo belongs to the Niger-Congo language family, one of the largest language families in the world. What stands out is its internal diversity. Igbo has many dialects, some quite different from each other. That actually happens when communities remain in one region for long periods and slowly diverge. Recent migrations tend to preserve tighter linguistic uniformity. Once again, the evidence points towards long-term settlement and internal development. We'll come back to how all these factors, DNA, archaeology, social systems, and language, combine to challenge the origin myths we started with. By the time the Europeans began documenting the region in detail, these societies had already been heavily disrupted. The Atlantic slave trade fractured communities and reshaped political life, leaving outsiders to interpret a society under extreme strain. That context matters. Colonial scholars often encountered fragmented systems and assumed they were primitive rather than damaged. External origins offered a convenient explanation. Later, biblical or Near Eastern connections offered a different kind of prestige, linking African history to already respected civilizations. It's important to note that Igbo oral traditions, like all histories, carry deep wisdom and memory, sometimes symbolic, sometimes literal, and they remind us that identity is woven from many threads. But both approaches share the same assumption, that complexity must come from somewhere else. That assumption is the real myth. Taken together, DNA, archaeology, language, and social structure tell a consistent story. The Igbo did not suddenly arrive from elsewhere as a unified group. They developed where they are over long periods, shaped by environment, interaction, and internal choice. No lost empire, no vanished homeland, no single founding moment. And that is not a disappointment. It's an achievement. Complex society without centralized kingship. Innovation without conquest. Continuity without empire. This is a story of resilience, creativity, and sophisticated organization. A model of human ingenuity that stands proudly on its own. That challenges how many people, especially in the West, expect civilization to work. Large areas of southeastern Nigeria remain under-excavated. Even so, the sites we do have show continuity rather than sudden replacement, which is why the broader pattern holds. Genetic sampling across West Africa is incomplete. Early African history remains underfunded compared to Europe or the Near East. Certainty will grow slowly, but uncertainty here is not weakness, it's discipline. If future discoveries change the picture, they will almost certainly add detail, not overturn the direction of the evidence. When we ask what DNA and archaeology actually say about Igbo origins, the answer isn't dramatic, it's stronger. They say the Igbo are not a borrowed civilization, not a footnote to someone else's story. They are the product of time, place, and human agency, working exactly as history usually does, when we allow it to speak without forcing it into familiar myths. And that story doesn't need embellishment. It only needs care. The story of the Igbo reminds us that African history is deep, diverse, and still being uncovered, and it invites us all to look again with curiosity and care. Every episode is a new chance to test what you know and, of course, rethink what you thought you knew. Be sure to like, subscribe, and come back next time where we test your knowledge on something entirely different.